Some doors are locked, not with keys, but with silence, and once opened, they cannot be shut again. Tonight's mystery begins in a solicitor's quiet chamber, where a forgotten codicil threatens to reshape the fate of an old English estate, and awakens secrets that were never meant to surface. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. The fog has cleared just enough for us to see the path ahead, so let us step into the shadows, where truth waits with a patient breath. It was upon a grey November morning, the kind of damp-laden day which hangs its melancholy across the streets of London like a mourning veil, that I sat opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street. The coals in the grate gave off a low and steady glow, and Holmes, long limbs folded, fingertips pressed in meditative pose, stared absently at the pattern of soot on the fire screen. The silence between us was companionable, not awkward. Outside, a milk cart rattled by, and somewhere on the street below, a child called out for a dog. Holmes had not spoken since breakfast. The newspaper lay unread upon the table, untouched since Mrs. Hudson brought it in with the post. It was then that a sharp knock sounded at the door, followed by Mrs. Hudson herself entering with a stiff envelope upon a tray. "A gentleman's man left this just now, sir. No name. Only said it was urgent." Holmes inclined his head but did not move. I took the letter and turned it over. The paper was heavy and cream-coloured, with a seal I recognized from my time in the army courts, a legal crest of some repute. I passed it to Holmes, who broke the seal in a single, fluid gesture. Holmes unfolded the sheet, scanned it once, and then again more slowly. I watched his grey eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. When at last he spoke, it was in that quiet, deliberate tone I'd come to associate with approaching interest. "It is from Mr. Alfred Canning of Lincoln's Inn, a solicitor of long standing, though not one I have had personal cause to encounter. He writes to request my presence in a matter involving the estate of the late Lord Eastbury." He paused and tapped the edge of the letter against his knee. "There is some complication, it seems. A concern both legal and delicate in its moral implication," are his words. I leaned forward slightly. "Lord Eastbury passed away only last week. The funeral was attended by half the city's titled class." Holmes nodded, folded the letter, and dropped it on the mantel. "It appears his death has not brought with it the peace his family expected. I confess, the name of Lord Eastbury stirred something faintly in my mind, and later that day I sought out the particulars in the Times. As I recalled, he had been a peer of some consequence in the House of Lords, an austere figure, rarely seen in public after the passing of his wife nearly a decade prior. His residence, Hall in Sussex, had for some years become the object of whispered speculation. It was said that the lord had grown reclusive, living with only his adult children, Emily and Gerald, and the household staff who had served the family since childhood. The funeral had been a private affair. No cause for alarm had been raised, yet the solicitor's summons, delivered in such haste and discretion, hinted at something unresolved, something not laid to rest with the body in the family vault. Holmes said nothing further that day, but I observed that he took the letter with him when you retired that night, and that the next morning the fire in his eyes had returned. It was I who read aloud the second letter when it arrived, this one written in Mr. Canning's own hand and delivered the following morning. "Lord Eastbury," I read, "left in his study a writing desk of unusual design. The desk is secured by 3 locks, each requiring a separate key to be opened. The keys were entrusted to 3 individuals: his daughter, Miss Emily Eastbury, his cousin, Mr. Lionel Wade, and his clergyman, the Reverend Thomas Phelps Holmes. Seated in the armchair by the fire, leaned forward slightly. That arrangement is not uncommon among men who distrust their heirs. But it suggests one thing, Watson. The contents of the desk are meant to be viewed collectively." I continued. "The instruction, written in Lord Eastbury's own hand and attached to the desk, reads only, 'To be opened in the presence of all 3 key holders. No sooner, no later.'" Holmes was silent for a moment. A locked box is no mystery in itself, but a man who goes to such lengths to prevent even his children from opening it. He is not hiding wealth, Watson. He is hiding judgment. We arrived at Mr. Canning's office in Lincoln's Inn 2 days later. He was a lean, dry man with a voice like parchment, and the air of one who has seen every species of folly that London can produce. "It is Miss Eastbury who urged me to write to you, Mr. Holmes," he explained, as he handed over a carefully copied transcript of her words. "She believes, though she will not say upon what basis, that what lies within the desk is dangerous." Holmes read silently. Then aloud, "My father feared what he had written. He told me once, near the end, that a name was too great a burden to pass on. I believe there is a letter within, and I believe it will undo all that remains of our family if it is ever read." He laid the paper down and steepled his fingers. "Fear, guilt, and a dying man's final precaution. This is no longer merely a question of inheritance." For a long moment after Mr. Canning's voice fell silent, Holmes did not respond. The room was very still. Outside the chamber window, the bare limbs of a London elm scratched faintly against the glass. At last Holmes rose. "Mr. Canning, I shall require the precise location and layout of Eastbury Hall, the names of all current residents and staff, and a statement from each of the 3 keyholders, however brief, regarding their understanding of the desk and its significance." Canning nodded gravely. "Miss Eastbury is expecting you. I shall telegraph her at once." As we stepped out into the fog-draped corridor that led back toward Chancery Lane, Holmes spoke, not to me, but into the grey air before him. "There are cases, Watson, in which the crime lies not in what was done, but in what has been buried. I suspect Eastbury Hall holds something more than dust in its locked drawers." And without further word, he hailed a hansom cab and instructed the driver to Baker Street. The matter had begun. Our journey to Sussex was undertaken in that late November twilight, which seems always to precede some unwholesome revelation. Holmes was unusually quiet during the long rail journey, his arms folded and his gaze fixed on the shadowed countryside slipping past our carriage window. I did not disturb his thoughts. I had long since learned that Holmes required silence as much as analysis in his method, and that it was often in these still interludes that the first glimmerings of deduction began to form. We changed at 3 Bridges and took a hired trap the remainder of the way. As we left the village behind and began the slow ascent toward Eastbury Hill, I noted the hedgerows grown wild, the trees bowed by wind, and the stone gateposts which bore the worn crest of the Eastbury name. A thin drizzle had begun to fall, and the lane was mottled with leaves the colour of rusted coin. The house revealed itself at last as we turned a bend, grey stone, gabled, its windows blankly reflecting the dull sky. I felt, as one sometimes does before crossing a threshold, the pressure of something long held and deeply buried waiting on the other side. We had scarcely dismounted before the front door opened and a woman stepped forward to greet us. Miss Emily Eastbury was a woman in her middle years, plain of face, but bearing that peculiar dignity which arises from inner gravity. She wore mourning, though not extravagantly. Her expression was neither sorrowful nor welcoming, but reserved, as though the weight of propriety alone had summoned her to the threshold. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and precise, "and Dr. Watson. You are expected." Holmes bowed slightly, offering neither hand nor smile. Miss Eastbury. Without further ceremony, she turned and led us through the entryway. I confess there was something in her stillness, some held breath of the spirit, that I found faintly troubling. It was not grief that clung to her, but a kind of vigilance, as though the dead man's secrets still paced the corridors behind her. The hall was broad and high-ceilinged, but the air within was cool and stagnant. Though well kept, there lingered the unmistakable scent of closed draperies and disuse. Framed hunting prints lined the walls, and the chandelier above us bore traces of tarnish along its chains. In the drawing-room, The fireplace had been lit, but the warmth did not seem to reach the corners of the space. Holmes moved about the chamber with slow deliberation, his gaze taking in not merely the objects, but the manner of their arrangement. It was, I thought, less a home than a museum, each item carefully preserved, yet untouched by the vitality of the living. A silver-topped cane rested against the sideboard, and an empty armchair bore a slight depression in its seat cushion, as though the departed lord still sat in judgment over the room. It was here we were joined by Gerald Eastbury. He entered with the careless gait of a man who has long ceased to monitor the impression he leaves behind. His collar was loosened, his waistcoat unbuttoned, and there was a flush along the cheekbones which I attributed not to the fireplace, but to a decanter in some neighbouring room. "Holmes, is it?" he said, extending a hand without waiting for a reply. "The man who solves riddles and unsettles families." Holmes took the hand briefly, without comment. "Don't mind me," Gerald continued with a short, bitter laugh. "My sister will be eager to lay the whole matter before you. I, for one, have made my peace with the dead." He dropped into the chair opposite the fire and stared into it, saying nothing more. The silence that followed was not merely social discomfort. It was the silence of a man who had already resigned himself to losing something he had not yet possessed. As Holmes and I were led through the remainder of the lower floor, we were introduced to Mrs. Bence, the housekeeper of Eastbury Hall. She was a woman of advanced years, spare of frame and severe of aspect, whose dark dress and white collar rendered her almost monastic in appearance. She greeted us with a nod, not a curtsy, and spoke little beyond what was required. Yet her gaze lingered, particularly upon Holmes, and I saw in her the unmistakable scrutiny of one who knew precisely what a man was by how he stood in a room. "She has been with us since before my brother and I were born," Miss Eastbury remarked once Mrs. Bence had moved on. "There is little in this house that has escaped her notice, though what she chooses to speak of is another matter." Holmes's reply was a single syllable. "Indeed." It was in the study, before the fire, that Miss Eastbury at last spoke to Holmes without reserve. I stood a little apart, watching her face by the light of the flames. "My father was a man of stature, Mr. Holmes," she began, her hands clasped tightly before her, "but not always of clarity. In his final year he grew preoccupied. He spent long hours in this room. We would hear him pacing late into the night." She drew breath. "He spoke once of a decision that could not be undone, that if he failed to lock it away, it would consume all that remained of his name." She turned toward the desk. "I believe the letter he wrote, if indeed it lies within, was not meant to be found. Not by us, not by anyone." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he said very gently, "And yet, Miss Eastbury, it was placed beneath 3 locks, each entrusted to the living. That suggests a message meant, eventually, to be heard." Her eyes did not meet his, or a burden meant to be shared. The light of the flames cast dancing shadows across the upper wall, where a portrait of Lord Eastbury hung, a sombre likeness in oils, painted in late middle age. Holmes studied it with interest. "The painter has captured a man not without conscience," he murmured. "Note the eyes. There is calculation there, but not coldness." Emily followed his gaze. "He was not a cruel man, Mr. Holmes." "No," Holmes said, still observing the image, "but he was a man who understood the weight of concealment." At this, Miss Eastbury paled slightly and excused herself. Holmes did not speak for some time after she had gone. That evening, as we settled into the guest quarters prepared for us, a knock came upon the door. Holmes opened it to reveal a young footman bearing a telegram. "It came to the village office, sir." The operator said it was urgent. Holmes thanked him, then tore the envelope open. His brow furrowed. "Wade is dead," he said simply. I started. "What?" "Mr. Lionel Wade, found this morning in his chambers, stabbed. No signs of forced entry." "And the key?" I asked. He looked down at the telegram again. "Gone." For several minutes neither of us spoke. At last Holmes folded the slip and placed it upon the table. "It would appear, Watson," he said quietly, "that one of the locks upon Eastbury's secret has already been broken." We returned to London the following morning beneath a sky of lead and ash. Holmes spoke not a word during our passage, though his eyes remained open and ever watchful, flicking now and again towards the passing landscape, as though the hedgerows themselves might yield some piece of the puzzle. The news of Wade's murder had left an impression upon us both, though my companion, in his characteristic fashion, wore his thoughts like a veil of glass, transparent yet impenetrable. The train rattled steadily northward, and I found myself recalling the brief conversation I had once had with Mr. Lionel Wade at a charity dinner. He had struck me as a reserved, even retiring man, one whose manner suggested a life lived slightly behind a curtain, too correct to provoke curiosity. That such a man should now lie dead in his own chambers, violently, purposefully, was a fact that could not be ignored. Holmes folded his hands together. "It is the absence of chaos that most concerns me," he murmured. "We shall see, soon enough." Wade's chambers in Bloomsbury were orderly to the point of sterility. A manservant, visibly shaken, admitted us with trembling fingers, and stood mutely aside while Holmes made his examination. The parlour was modestly furnished. Mahogany chairs, a glass-fronted bookcase, and a fireplace still bearing the scent of old coal. There was, as Holmes had foreseen, no evidence of struggle. A tea service rested on a side table, untouched. A paper knife lay precisely aligned with the corner of a blotting pad. And in the centre of the room, just beyond the rug's edge, a dark stain marked the place where Wade had collapsed, stabbed once, directly through the heart. Holmes knelt beside the mark, eyes scanning every detail. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "The fatal act was committed by someone Wade knew. The room remains unaltered. Nothing has been ransacked." "And the key?" I asked. Holmes rose slowly. "Gone. Naturally. It was I who noticed the faint smell of burnt paper still lingering near the hearth." Holmes approached the fireplace, reached carefully into the iron grate, and withdrew a partially charred scrap. He laid it across the mantel, brushing away the flakes of ash with gentle precision. Only a few words remained, seared but legible. "Do not open it. Until—" "Until what?" I murmured. Holmes stared at the page with a strange intensity. "Until the third arrives? Until a time has passed? Or until it is safe?" The ambiguity is intentional. A warning without a fixed condition becomes, in effect, a curse. He folded the scrap and placed it in his inner pocket. "This was not written in fear," he said. "It was written in hope. That makes the silence which followed all the more terrible." Holmes circled the perimeter of the room, taking note of the polish upon the doorknob, the absence of scuff marks on the floorboards, the faint but unmistakable scent of expensive cologne, one that had not belonged to Wade himself. "There was no forced entry," he said at key, but to silence the bearer of it, he turned toward me. "We must now protect the last." Back at Baker Street, Holmes penned a note in his fine, slanted hand and sealed it with wax. "To Lestrade," he said simply. "It is time we involve Scotland Yard, though only at arm's length." I raised a brow. "You believe Phelps to be in danger?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that the killer has not finished what he has begun. The second key has been taken by blood. If the third is not seized soon, it may slip out of reach. Or worse, Lestrade, when he arrived that evening, appeared no more enthusiastic than usual to be summoned. "You want me to babysit a parson?" he said, sniffing. "I've more pressing duties than chaperoning country clergy." Holmes was unmoved. And if the clergy in question carries an object for which 2 men have already died? Lestrade's countenance shifted. "Very well," he muttered. "Give me the name." The Reverend Thomas Phelps, it turned out, had already begun his journey to Eastbury by the time Lestrade received Holmes's telegram. We were informed of this by telegram ourselves, forwarded from the Kent parsonage by a housemaid who noted the time of his departure and his intent to arrive by evening train. He was in good spirits, the maid had written. He said he had no doubt the good Lord would bless his journey. Holmes reread the message several times before lowering it without comment. "He carries the key in his coat pocket," he said. "How do you know?" "Because the Reverend is a man of honesty," Holmes replied. "And men of honesty are woefully predictable. He would never think to hide it, because he cannot imagine the world in which it is stolen." I glanced out the window at the lowering sky. Let us pray he arrives unscathed. The prayer, alas, was not answered. At precisely 9:15, a telegram arrived from the station master at Lewes. It read, "Reverend, Phelps boarded at Maidstone, did not disembark here. Belongings found on seat. No sign of passenger." Holmes read the message aloud, then folded it carefully and placed it upon the mantel, without expression. "The second key has vanished in silence," he said, "and the man who bore it has vanished likewise." We returned to Eastbury Hall, under the veil of a sharp wind and a heavy, watchful sky. There was something altered in the very air of the place, though no hand had shifted a single stone. The house stood as before, grave and grey, against the bare trees. Yet its stillness no longer seemed merely that of mourning. Rather, it had become the silence of anticipation, of something withheld that now stirred, faint and uncertain, just beneath the surface. As we passed through the main corridor, I could not help but note that the lamps burned lower, the rugs lay slightly askew, and a draught crept along the walls in whispering pulses. I fancied the house, like ourselves, had heard the news of Wade's death, and now waited for some judgment to fall. Holmes, for his part, did not speak until we entered the study. Then, with a glance toward the desk, he said in a low voice, "We are not the only ones who have returned here, Watson." Holmes approached the desk with the reverence one might afford a reliquary. He circled it slowly, observing not only the object itself, but the floor, the air, and the very pattern of shadow that fell across its surface. "The locks have been disturbed," he said after a moment, "particularly the central one." I stepped closer and saw it as he did, faint, almost imperceptible scratches upon the brass plate, no doubt missed by any ordinary eye. The marks were shallow, but deliberate, the kind made not by time, but by a careful hand, one not yet certain of its course. Holmes crouched beside the desk, placing one gloved finger gently upon the marred surface. "Whoever tried this," he said quietly, "did so with restraint, hesitation even. They feared what might follow, should the lock yield." He rose, "And yet they tried." It was as Holmes stepped back that he paused abruptly, his eyes narrowing toward the corner of the rug. There, just beyond the carved leg of the desk, lay the faint impression of a half-dried smear. Earth, dark and fine, mingled with a trace of crushed leaf. He knelt once more, drawing back the edge of the rug with a surgeon's care. Beneath, another mark revealed itself. An incomplete footprint, angled slightly outward. Holmes leaned closer. A narrow sole, high arch, foreign-made, likely continental. And here, he added, tracing a faint line with his fingertip, a small notch near the instep. A factory floor, perhaps, but one which will not escape us again. He looked up at me. Kitchens, where she stood overseeing the laying of the table with a strict but quiet intensity. Something in her bearing, however, perhaps the faint pallor in her cheeks or the tightness about the eyes, suggested that she too had noticed the shifting current within the household. "Mrs. Bence," I said gently. "Forgive my intrusion. I wonder if I might ask, had Lord Eastbury received any troubling correspondence in his final months?" She did not answer at once, but turned slowly to face me. Her expression was unreadable. "There was a letter," she said at last. "It arrived by private post. No seal, no return name. I brought it to him myself." "And what did he do with it?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "He burned it. Not in the grate, mind you, but in the garden incinerator. And he told me, in a voice I had not heard since his youth, that I was never to speak of it again." I inclined my head. "But now you have." "I have," she whispered. "Because I fear what we did not speak of is what has come home to us now." At luncheon, Holmes and I joined Emily and her brother at table, where the meal, though well prepared, was taken under a silence more oppressive than any quarrel. Gerald Eastbury appeared slightly improved in appearance, though his eyes remained red-rimmed and his movements erratic. Miss Eastbury, by contrast, was composed to the point of brittleness, as though each word she withheld were a stone in her throat. Twice she reached for her glass and then set it down untouched. Gerald, for his part, watched her with a half-concealed smirk, and at one point muttered, "I suppose it will all be out soon enough." She did not respond, nor look his way. It was a silence not of ignorance, but of exhaustion. Holmes spoke very little during the meal, but I noted that he watched them both with the attention he usually reserved for suspects. Quiet, patient, and pitiless. Later that afternoon, Holmes and I returned to the study, ostensibly to examine the desk once more, though I knew from his manner that his thoughts had already turned elsewhere. As he traced the line of books upon the shelves, most of them dry histories and treatises of law, his hand paused on a familiar name. "Gibbon," he said idly. "Volume 4, out of order." He withdrew the book and reached instinctively behind it. His fingers emerged a moment later holding a small object, rectangular, wooden, and stained with use. "A careless hand," he murmured. "Or a hurried one." The object was a matchbox, cheaply made, the sort distributed freely in the lower quarters of the city. But it bore, on one side, the unmistakable imprint of the Hare and Comb, a public house of sordid repute situated near Whitechapel Road. Holmes turned it over in his fingers. There are few reasons why a gentleman such as Lord Eastbury would keep such a relic within reach. Fewer still to conceal it. He pried it open. Inside was a single match, unstruck. "Not for fire, then," he said softly. "For memory. Or threat." I regarded him in silence. "Whitechapel, Watson," he added, "where one finds not only vice, but truth far less curated than what is served at Eastbury's table." He pocketed the matchbox. "We must go there next. I believe someone still burns with what this house has long since buried." We departed Eastbury beneath a sky shrouded in low mist, the quiet of the Sussex hills soon giving way to the restless churn of London's eastern quarter. As we passed through the city's outer boroughs, Holmes grew increasingly withdrawn, his hands buried deep in his overcoat pockets, his gaze flicking restlessly between faces and shadows, as if assembling an invisible map known only to him. Whitechapel had changed little since last I saw it, its streets narrow, its cobblestones uneven, and its air thick with the mingled scent of soot, refuse, and the stale remnants of unwashed gin. The matchbox we had discovered bore the stamp of a public house known to Holmes by reputation. The Hare and Comb, a den more familiar to thieves than gentlemen, though not unfamiliar to those with a secret to sell or silence. "We shall not find elegance here," Holmes remarked as we disembarked, "but we may yet find honesty, of a sort peculiar to this quarter of the city." Inside the Hare and Comb, the atmosphere was heavy with damp tobacco and the pungent sweetness of spilled spirits. A fire sputtered behind a cracked iron grate, and the few patrons spoke in tones too low to decipher. Holmes made no introduction, but moved directly to the bar, where a sullen-eyed girl of perhaps 20 stood polishing a glass with more force than focus. "We seek information," he said simply, placing a sovereign upon the counter, "concerning a gentleman who visited this place on more than one occasion in the past year. Distinguished, grave, wore a signet ring upon his left hand. Accompanied, at least once, by a younger woman." The girl hesitated, then took the coin and slipped it beneath the counter. "You mean the Lord?" she asked, without looking up. Holmes inclined his head. "Aye, I remember. Sat in the corner booth near the fire. Always ordered port. Never drank half of it. Came with a girl, quiet, delicate, foreign eyes. She cried once. Left with an envelope, trembling like a leaf." "Did they argue?" "No," she said. "Worse than that." He wouldn't meet her eyes. She left fast, didn't come back. Holmes said nothing for a time. Then, "Did he?" "Only once more. Sat in the same place. Alone." Holmes drew a small notebook from his coat and laid it beside the empty glass. "Did you happen to catch the girl's name?" The barmaid frowned, then shook her head. "He called her something soft. Elise, I think. Might have said Miss Elise. Didn't sound English." "Elise," Holmes repeated softly, closing the notebook. "And she took the envelope with her?" "That she did. Clutched it like it was something holy, or poisoned." Holmes turned to go, but paused. "You've been helpful." The girl shrugged. "Everyone has their sorrows, sir. Even lords. Especially lords." Outside, the fog had thickened, muting the gaslights into pale orbs that hung in the air like distant moons. Holmes walked for some time in silence, then said, as much to himself as to me, "He gave it to her willingly. That tells us much." "You believe it was the codicil?" I asked. "Possibly. Or a letter of confession. Perhaps both. But whatever its contents, it was not meant for the Eastbury family to read. Not yet." "Why trust her with it?" "Because she was the subject of it," Holmes replied. He feared the damage such a letter might do in his own house, but he feared more what would happen if she was left with nothing. "And what became of her?" Holmes glanced towards the pavement. "That, Watson, is what we must now discover. But I suspect that in hiding her, he set this tragedy in motion. For if the envelope contained proof of name or claim or blood, then its very existence would threaten someone." He drew his coat more tightly, and someone has begun to act. We had scarcely arrived at Charing Cross, Holmes intending to consult a certain French notary familiar with the émigré community, when the telegram boy found us. Holmes opened the envelope with a swift flick of the hand. I saw his brow darken even as his expression stilled. "What is it?" I asked. "Phelps has been found. In a Brighton alleyway. Unconscious, bruised, without wallet or key." He handed me the message. It was from Lestrade. "Clergyman discovered by police patrol. No memory of attack. No injuries beyond mild concussion. No sign of key." Holmes crushed the envelope in his palm. "The thief grows bolder," he said, "and nearer." We arrived at Scotland Yard later that evening, where Lestrade awaited us with his usual mixture of officious pride and underlying irritation. "He's awake now," he said, "frightened out of his senses. Can't tell north from west, let alone what hit him." "Did he have the key?" Holmes asked. Lestrade shook his head. "Says he placed it in the inner pocket of his travelling coat. That coat was found beside him, neatly folded, empty, and his account of the attack, a blur. Said he noticed a shadow just before the blow. No face, no voice, just dark and gone." Holmes said nothing. Lestrade sniffed. "You think it was your desk thief again?" Holmes replied coldly, "I think we are dealing with a mind far more dangerous than a mere thief." Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood before the window, one hand pressed against the cold pane. Outside, The street lamps flickered in the wind, and the gas hissed gently from the stove. "We have lost 2 key holders," he said softly, "one to death, the other to fear. The desk remains closed, but its guardian hinges are falling away." "And the 3rd key?" I asked. He did not turn. "They will not wait for it to be offered. They will take it as they took the others." There was a long pause. Then Holmes murmured, "The question, Watson, is not who possesses the key, but who still dares to keep it." The carriage wheels crackled upon the frozen gravel as Eastbury Hall loomed once more through the bare limbs of the surrounding elms. Though only days had passed since our previous visit, the house now struck me as altered in some indefinable way. The cold clung more bitterly to the stone. The windows looked out with an air more watchful than vacant, and the long corridor leading from the front entrance seemed steeped in a silence thicker than mere decorum. Holmes said little as we disembarked, save for a brief nod to the footman who received us, but I observed that his windows with careful precision, and that he lingered at the threshold a moment longer than necessary, his gloved hand resting on the doorframe as though to take its temperature. "Something has shifted here," he said quietly as we entered. "The house knows what has been taken." Miss Eastbury received us with her customary reserve, though I thought I detected a tremor beneath her polished self-command. She asked Holmes, with a subtle glance in my direction, if he might join her in the garden for a moment's air before the light faded. He acquiesced, and I watched from the parlour window as the 2 figures moved slowly along the broken path that led through what had once been a rose garden. The vines were brittle now, tangled and grey, clinging to rusted trellises and overgrown stone. Against this desolation, Miss Eastbury's black silhouette appeared like a mourner among ruins. Her head inclined toward Holmes, but her arms folded tightly against the chill. I could not hear their exchange, but I saw the moment she stopped walking and placed her hand upon the low stone wall. The wind lifted a strand of hair from her cheek, and even through the glass I sensed the effort in her posture. The effort of one preparing to release something long held in darkness. When they returned indoors, Miss Eastbury led us directly to the study and closed the door behind us. There, in the dimming light, she turned to Holmes and said without preface, "You will ask. So I shall tell you what I know." Holmes inclined his head without speaking. "My father," she began, "once employed a French governess, a Miss Elise Marchand. She was with us for only 2 years, but in that time she became necessary. Not only to my brother and me, but—" She hesitated, then continued, "to my father. She was quiet, clever, and possessed of a gentleness none of us could match. My mother had been gone some years. I believe he came to depend upon Elise more than he ever intended." She crossed to the hearth and stood with her back to us. "Then, one summer, she vanished. No notice, no farewell. My father claimed she had accepted a post abroad, but I found a half-written letter in her handwriting, never posted, expressing fear and confusion. After that, her name was not spoken again." Holmes's voice, when it came, was softer than I had expected. "Did you confront your father?" "I did. He denied nothing, but he explained less." Holmes stood very still, as though listening to something within the stillness of the room itself. "And the desk?" he asked gently. "You believe it contains a letter?" She nodded. "Not a will, not a codicil, something personal. An account, perhaps, or a confession. Something he meant to lock away until after his death. I do not think he feared its contents for himself, Mr. Holmes. He feared them for us." She moved to the desk and laid her hand upon the wood. "He told me once, during his final illness, that what we inherit is not always silver and land. Sometimes it is silence, and that silence must be paid for." She turned toward us then, and I saw for the first time the toll the years of restraint had taken upon her. Her eyes were dry, but ringed with fatigue, and her voice, when she spoke again, trembled with something deeper than fear. "I loved Elise," she said, "not as a sister perhaps, but as something near it. I was 16 when she disappeared, and I always believed my father had driven her away." "You believed he harmed her?" I asked gently. "No," she replied, "only that he was capable of care too intense for someone in her position. And when she returned that affection, or refused it, I do not know which, he concealed the truth in shame and buried it." She glanced again at the desk. I think he wrote it down, not for absolution, but because he could no longer live with what he had denied. And now, she looked at Holmes, now someone else wishes to deny it as well. That evening we dined in silence. Gerald Eastbury did not appear, and Mrs. Bence excused herself early with the claim of an ailing stomach. Only Miss Eastbury remained with us at table, and even she seemed more ghost than hostess, present in form, but withdrawn in spirit. Afterwards, Holmes and I took our brandy in the study. The fire had been lit, but its glow seemed dimmer than usual, as though the chimney itself conspired in the mood of the house. Holmes stood for a long time before the window, his profile outlined by frost-laced panes. Beyond, the garden lay quiet beneath a pallid moon. The once-ordered hedges now warped into shadows. "They have failed twice," he said at last. "They will try a third time, and soon. But next time, Watson, they may come not to steal, but to destroy." It was shortly past midnight when I made my way swiftly down the corridor toward the study. Holmes met me in the hallway, already alert, his eyes alight with grim anticipation. Together we descended the staircase, the scent now thick enough to catch at the throat. The study door stood ajar. Within, the fire had nearly died, but not so entirely that it failed to reveal the source of the disturbance. A dark figure, cloaked, gloved, was hunched over the desk, a small tin of paraffin overturned upon the surface. A box of matches lay open nearby. Holmes moved swiftly. "Not yet," he said coolly, stepping forward. The figure froze, then bolted toward the opposite door. Holmes made no attempt to pursue, but crossed instead to the desk. The flame had caught only at the edge, charring one corner, but leaving the central compartment intact. Holmes extinguished the smouldering patch with the hearthrug, then stood in silence. "A poor attempt," he said, "but no longer a silent one." He looked at me then, and there was steel in his voice. "The time for watching has passed. We must open the past now, before someone succeeds in burying it for good." The following evening, as the house settled into its habitual hush, Holmes called me into the study and laid before me a plan as precise and restrained as the man himself. He had no need for drama, only patience and darkness. "We shall not pursue our quarry," he said. "We shall wait for him." He extinguished the lamps one by one, leaving only the glow of embers in the grate. A fine haze of wood smoke hung in the air. Holmes motioned for me to position myself just outside the door, where I would remain concealed behind the velvet drapery lining the corridor wall. I was not to intervene unless I heard the signal. 3 sharp knocks upon the panel. Holmes, meanwhile, positioned himself in the shadows between the desk and the tall bookcase, crouched low, his breathing scarcely audible. "If he returns," Holmes murmured, before disappearing into the gloom, "it will be tonight." And so we waited, not with excitement, but with the quiet dread that belongs to truth when it walks toward one slowly, on known feet. The hours passed with almost glacial reluctance. I confess, more than once, my thoughts drifted to warmer rooms and easier comforts. But I knew Holmes, and I knew the weight behind his silences. This night was not idle speculation. It was culmination. Then, shortly before midnight, the house shifted. Not in volume, but in temperature. A subtle pressure in the air changed, as if a held breath had been released into the corridor. I stiffened, straining to distinguish natural groanings of wood from something more intentional. Then it came. The creak of a hinge, faint but unmistakable. The study door, which had been shut to, not latched, opened with a cautious hand. A figure slipped inside, dark-coated, muffled, moving with haste born not of stealth, but desperation. A pause, then the clink of brass, the unmistakable rattle of a key against a stubborn lock. And still Holmes did not move. The match was struck, and its flame briefly illuminated the pale face bent over the desk, drawn, damp with exertion, the eyes wide and restless. Holmes stepped forward into the light with swift finality. "Not this time, Mr. Eastbury." The intruder flinched back with a cry, not of surprise, but of shame. It was Gerald. In the half-light I saw his hands, red and raw at the knuckles, burned, perhaps, from his earlier attempt to destroy what he could not open. His breath came in sharp, uneven pulls, and the faint odour of spirits clung to him like a second skin. For a moment, no one moved. Then Holmes reached for the match and calmly extinguished it between finger and thumb. We sat Gerald down in the fireside chair, where he buried his face in his hands. It was some minutes before he spoke. "I thought it would name her," he muttered finally. "The girl. I thought he'd done it, put it in writing, a codicil, and I'd be nothing." Holmes watched him carefully. "So you sought to ensure it was never read." Gerald looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, but not empty. "Wouldn't you? A stranger, born of scandal, walking in to take hearth? No, perhaps, but not a murderer." Gerald flinched as though struck. "The death of Mr. Wade," Holmes continued, "and the assault upon Reverend Phelps, these were not acts of desperation, but of calculation. You possess neither the temperament nor the cleverness required. Your movements are erratic, your reasoning emotional. I do not say this to flatter you, but to exonerate you." Gerald looked at him, unsure whether to take this as vindication or insult. Holmes turned toward the desk. "You sought to destroy the past. I intend to unlock it." From within his coat, Holmes withdrew a small leather case, the kind I had seen him use more than once during our more delicate investigations. He opened it upon the writing table and revealed a single, slender key, its teeth hand-filed with almost surgical precision. "I had this made," he said, "while in London 3 days ago. The original was in Miss Eastbury's possession. She permitted me a brief examination." Gerald stared, aghast. "Then you've always meant—" "To open the desk?" Holmes completed. "Yes, but only when I had sufficient context to understand what we might find within. A document without interpretation is merely ink. I prefer truth." He crossed to the desk, which bore still the faint scorch where Gerald's prior assault had failed. Holmes cleaned the lock with a cloth and inserted the key. "There are moments," he said quietly, "when violence nearly wins, but history has its own patience." I watched in silence as Holmes turned the key. There was a soft click, followed by a faint sigh. No mechanical trick, but the release of something long confined. The drawer slid open with surprising ease. Inside lay 2 objects: a folded envelope, yellowed at the edges, and beneath it, a vellum-bound document bearing the seal of Lord Eastbury. Holmes lifted the envelope first and passed it to Miss Eastbury, who had entered the room some moments earlier without sound. She took it in both hands, her face unreadable. The document Holmes laid gently upon the desk. "The codicil," he said. "Legal, witnessed, and, judging from the ink, written no more than a month before his death." Miss Eastbury opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Holmes did not read over her shoulder, nor did I. Instead, he stepped back and said, in the softest voice I ever heard him use, "Let the truth speak first to the living." And in that moment, even Gerald bowed his head. Holmes did not speak at first. The faint click of the final lock had echoed too intimately within the study, as if the past itself had sighed through the mechanism. He withdrew the central drawer slowly, revealing a shallow compartment beneath, cleverly inlaid. Within lay only two objects, both aged but meticulously preserved. One was a thick envelope, cream-coloured and addressed in a firm, sloping hand. "Miss Emily Eastbury, to be opened in the event of my passing." The other was a folded legal document, bound by a red silk ribbon, whose notarial seal had begun to flake with time. Emily, who stood just behind us, gave a small gasp. Her fingers trembled as Holmes handed her the letter. "This, I believe, was never meant to vanish," he murmured. She clutched it to her breast. "May I?" she asked. Holmes inclined his head with the gravity of a priest delivering absolution. "It is yours." We sat in reverent silence as she opened the letter and began to read aloud. The script was unmistakably that of Lord Eastbury, elegant and austere, the hand of a man accustomed to contracts and quiet dominion. "My dearest Emily," she began, voice unsteady yet resolute. "Should this letter find you, I shall have left this life with a burden unspoken. There are truths I did not trust myself to voice in daylight, for shame is a stubborn ghost, and mine is old." Emily paused. Holmes offered no interruption, his gaze distant, though I noted the tightening of his jaw. "Years ago, before your mother entered my life, I knew a woman named Elise Marchand. She was employed here briefly as governess, brilliant, spirited, and, alas, French, which in our circles became a sin twice over. When she conceived, I feared scandal more than I feared dishonour. I arranged for her departure, quietly and with funds. Text outlined that, in addition to Miss Emily Eastbury, a second party, the daughter of Elise Marchand, born in the year of our Lord 1874, was to be granted equal share of the estate. But here, curiously, the name was left absent, not stricken, not obscured, merely unwritten. "A curious omission," I remarked. "Surely a clerical error." Holmes shook his head. "No error. Deliberate restraint." He knew her identity, but feared to inscribe it. Either he never learned her assumed name, or he chose not to fix it in ink. Emily whispered. He wished her acknowledged, but not exposed. Holmes nodded once. An inheritance promised, but not pursued. Holmes requested the letter again, studying its final paragraphs with the intensity of a botanist examining a rare bloom. His finger halted upon a phrase. She left for Geneva in winter, accompanied by Madame R., whose discretion I came to rely upon. Geneva, he muttered. neutral ground. A favourite sanctuary for those wishing to be unremembered. I watched as he withdrew a small notebook from his coat and scribbled furiously. "We must examine consular filings," he said. London to Geneva was a well-worn route for the discreetly displaced. The British legation would have recorded any birth claims tied to Eastbury, however veiled. "And the French records?" I asked. "Less reliable," he replied, but Elise was no fool. She would not vanish entirely without a trace. By the following afternoon, Holmes had dispatched 3 telegrams, one to the Swiss consulate, another to a confidential agent in Paris, and a third, curiously, to a librarian of heraldic archives. "I seek not merely a name," he said to me that evening, "but the nature of its erasure." It was 4 days before a reply arrived. An official envelope from the Swiss consulate, its seal brittle from travel. Holmes opened it without ceremony. Inside was a succinct note. A woman matching the description of Mademoiselle Elise Marchand, accompanied by a child, was recorded in 1874 entering the canton of Geneva. She now resides under the assumed name Madame Amandine Durand. Address provided upon request. Holmes folded the paper with care and placed it in his pocketbook. "She survives," I said softly. "Yes, and under a pseudonym that suggests both concealment and reinvention. Amandine, the name of almonds. A bitter sweetness, is it not?" Emily sat quietly at the window, her hands clasped before her. "What shall I do?" she asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Then, "We shall go to her, if she permits. But first I must know why she remained so silent all these years. Not every absence is chosen." He turned back to the fireplace, the note still warm in his hand. That evening, Holmes sat long in thought beneath the gas lamp, pipe unlit, fingers steepled in meditation. At last he spoke. "There is something in this which offends reason," he said. "Madame Durand has lived for decades in quiet obscurity. No contact with the Eastbury estate, no attempt to claim her daughter's due, nor to speak with the child herself. Perhaps she feared shame," I offered. "Perhaps. But fear leaves traces, letters unsent, inquiries abandoned. This silence is immaculate, too immaculate." I saw it then, the deeper implication. "You believe she was paid to remain silent?" He nodded slowly. "Either by Lord Eastbury himself, or someone close to him. Perhaps a bribe, perhaps a plea. Either way it casts a long shadow." "And yet," I said, "she kept the child." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, which means she loved her more than she feared the truth." As the wind rattled faintly at the windows, Holmes closed the thin case file upon the study desk. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across his features. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "this was never a crime of greed." "No?" "No. Gerald sought to destroy the codicil, yes, but he did so out of fear of exclusion. Others, however, moved in deeper silence." He gestured towards the hearth, where the ash of burnt paper from nights past still lingered. The attempt to set fire to the desk was crude, but the earlier crime, the disappearance of Elise Marchand, was elegant in its invisibility. She was not merely sent away, she was removed from the ledger of memory. I sat back, chilled despite the fire. "And for what?" I asked. Holmes's voice was quiet. "Not for gold, Watson, but to preserve the illusion of purity. Someone killed not to inherit, but to erase." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of history, of shame, and of a secret at last disturbed. Holmes stood by the hearth with the last of the case paper spread like a deck of forgotten cards across the mahogany desk, scrap from the pile, and turned it over between his fingers. Violence, in this instance, was directed not toward gain, but toward remembrance. The desk, the documents, the very notion of legacy, someone sought to erase rather than inherit. And the pattern, he murmured, almost to himself, was always that of concealment. From the first. Outside, a cold wind rattled the panes, but in Holmes's stillness I sensed we had at last entered the final corridor of the truth. Holmes rose and, without a word, crossed to the bell-pull. I recognized in his silence a decision long in preparation. "Ask Mrs. Bence to join us," he said to the housemaid who answered. The instruction was mild, almost courteous, but it carried the weight of irrevocable summoning. When the housekeeper entered, her expression was composed as ever. There was no trace of trepidation in her demeanour, no trembling of the hands, no glance that wandered guiltily from the fire to the desk or back again. And yet, Holmes watched her, with the fixed attentiveness of a naturalist observing a specimen long suspected, but never confirmed. "You have kept this house well," Holmes began, "and your loyalty has been evident." Too evident, perhaps. Mrs. Bence gave no reply. Her eyes, dark and steady, rested on Holmes with something approaching defiance. He did not blink. But in every quiet footstep, in every withheld opinion, you have told a second story, Mrs. Bence. One I believe you have guarded far longer than your employer ever knew. "Watson," Holmes said without removing his gaze from the woman before us. "Do you recall the manner in which Lord Eastbury referred to Elise Marchand in his letter? With sorrow, yes, but also with care. Not the shameful phrasing of a man hiding an indiscretion, but the reverent tone of one mourning a beloved." I nodded slowly. "Now consider this. We have before us two women, Elise, the vanished paramour, and Mrs. Bence, the housekeeper of 20 years' unbroken service. One disappears to Geneva, the other remains and watches over this estate with silent vigilance. Is it not more than mere coincidence that both were French by origin?" A flicker crossed Mrs. Bence's face. Holmes noted it with the barest nod. "I propose," he continued, "that Elise and Eleanor Marchand were sisters. One chose love, at the cost of her name. The other chose duty, at the cost of her soul." Still the housekeeper said nothing, but in the tightening of her gloved hands, in the slight sagging of her shoulders, the foundations of silence had begun to crack. "There are debts," Holmes said quietly, "that are not measured in pounds or property, but in promises made in childhood, at deathbeds, or in the chill of a parent's disappointment." He turned to me then. "Imagine the scene. Two sisters, raised in a family of modest but proud station. One disgraced by a love deemed unworthy, the other left to hold the remnants together. A vow is made, not to speak, not to yield, not to let the shame spill outward." He looked once more to Mrs. Bence. "You have lived that vow with near religious precision." The woman's lips parted slightly, but no words came. "And so," Holmes added, "when the papers threatened to reopen what you had buried so long ago, you moved not to acquire, but to silence. Not to steal, but to protect." It was, I thought, a peculiar kind of loyalty, one which preserved honour by the quiet suffocation of truth. The morning room was filled with the thin gold light of a pale sun as we gathered once more by the desk. Holmes stood at its head, his figure composed, unflinching. "Mrs. Bence," he said, "you need not speak unless you wish to, but I must ask plainly. Did you remove the original key? Did you attempt to burn the codicil?" She did not move. "I believe," he went on, "that you acted alone, and without malice. But I also believe you feared, not what would be taken from you, but what would be exposed. The silence grew taut. Then, as if summoned by an unseen command, her shoulders twitched, and the hands clasped before her began to tremble. Holmes waited, not with cruelty, but with the still patience of a man who knows the truth, already walks among them, waiting only to be acknowledged. When the confession came, it was not loud. Indeed, it barely rose above the crackle of the hearth. She was my sister, Mrs. Bence said at last. My younger by 2 years. Beautiful, foolish, and far too trusting. She sat. The child. The child? I echoed. Mrs. Bence nodded. Emily. She was raised here, never knowing the truth. My sister's shame became mine to manage. I saw to it all. I thought if the desk was never opened, she would never have to bear it. Her voice broke. I only ever wanted to protect her. And for the first time since I had known her, Mrs. Bence wept. I watched as the woman, so long the embodiment of quiet resolve, crumbled beneath the weight of her long-held silence. There was no satisfaction in the exposure, no triumph in the confession. Only the sad gravity of a secret that had, over time, turned from protection to quiet cruelty. Secrecy, I said to Holmes later that evening, as we prepared to depart, is a strange thing. It begins in kindness and ends in suffocation. Holmes looked out at the leafless trees that bordered the Eastbury estate. It is not secrecy itself that corrodes, he replied, but the insistence that truth must shame rather than set free. This household was never undone by inheritance, Watson. It was undone by erasure. As we stepped into the carriage, I thought again of Mrs. Bence, not as a villain, nor even as a misguided soul, but as a woman bound by a promise no longer suitable to the world in which she now lived. And some ghosts, I reflected, demand to be remembered. It was a Thursday morning, cold and dry, when Holmes and I made our way through the unadorned corridors of Canning and Harrowby, solicitors of Lincoln's Inn. The brass nameplate outside the chamber door caught the early light with a faint metallic glint, a detail Holmes noted, as he did all things, with casual exactness. Inside, Mr. Canning received us with that same brand of worn civility, so particular to men of his profession. His hands, long and bony, seemed born to shuffle parchment and tap the edges of legal documents into alignment. The codicil, he began without preamble, is valid. It bears Lord Eastbury's final signature, witnessed by 2 servants, whose testimony we have obtained. He placed the document gently before Holmes. You have ensured it was retrieved in time. Holmes inclined his head slightly. And you will see it executed without obstruction. I will, said Canning, though not without raised eyebrows in certain quarters. Holmes allowed himself the barest smile. Eyebrows seldom interest me, Mr. Canning. Only the law. That evening, in the still hush of our Baker Street sitting room, Emily sat at the writing desk beside the hearth, her profile lit by the lamplight, and her brow composed in thought. She asked for no dictation, nor did she solicit Holmes's opinion. The words she penned were not forged in logic, but in something altogether more delicate, an instinct of kinship, a willingness to reach across the gulf of uncertainty. When she finished, she folded the letter with quiet precision, sealed it in blue wax, and addressed it in her own hand. Madame, Claire Durand, Hôtel des Bergues, Geneva. Holmes watched without intrusion. As she prepared it for post, he simply said, "Best not to trust the Royal Mail for such missives." Emily nodded. I had already thought to send it by hand. Some things must arrive with the certainty of intention, and so it was entrusted to a private courier, with instructions to await an answer before departing. The woman who entered the drawing-room at number 18, Wilton Crescent, was not what I had imagined, though in truth I had imagined very little. She was tall, though not imposingly so, and moved with the quiet bearing of one accustomed neither to grandeur nor to servitude. Her eyes, strikingly pale, scanned the room before settling on Emily, who stood by the window, uncertain, the faintest tremor in her hands betraying her. "Miss Eastbury," the woman said softly. Emily inclined her head. "You must be Claire." There was a pause, half a moment, but pregnant with the weight of things unsaid. Then Claire smiled, not broadly, but with unmistakable warmth. "You wrote with grace," she said, "and courage. I had neither, only a wish to know you." They sat. Tea was brought, but scarcely touched. I withdrew to the far end of the room, my presence reduced to that of observer, as Holmes had already taken his leave. In the conversation that followed, no voices were raised, no accusations laid. They spoke as two branches of the same tree, long separated by wind and fortune, now bending gently toward one another again. Gerald Eastbury arrived 2 days later, summoned the strut I had once observed in him, his coat unbuttoned and collar askew, his eyes bloodshot but clear. Mr. Canning handed him the papers, a single line indicating his forfeiture of the unchallenged estate. The codicil had altered the balance, and Gerald's portion was now trimmed by legal precision and paternal intent. He signed without comment, but as he handed the pen back, he looked not at the lawyer but at Holmes. "So it ends," he said bitterly. "I wonder if it ever began as I believed it did." "No man ever owns the future, Mr. Eastbury," Holmes replied. "Only his conduct within it." Gerald nodded once, then turned and left. He did not ask after Emily, nor speak of inheritance again. The carriage was seen by none but the gardener, who chanced to be trimming the south hedgerow when it departed, just after dawn. Mrs. Bence did not request assistance with her trunk, nor did she leave instructions for her successor. There was no farewell, only a brief note left in the scullery, addressed to Emily. "Forgive the keeping of silence. Some truths were never mine to tell, only to guard. I hope you will live unburdened." When I mentioned the matter to Holmes later that day, he merely replied, "Some women choose to vanish, not because they are cowards, but because they are finished." Eastbury Hall stood unchanged. The clock still ticked, the curtains still moved faintly in the wind. But its oldest watcher had left her post, and in that, something irreversible had occurred. It was the kind of afternoon London often offers in late February, grey without rain and cold without wind. Holmes and I walked the gravel path that bordered the Serpentine, our boots crunching softly, the trees standing bare and tall like monuments to a more ancient winter. We said little at first. Holmes's face bore that peculiar stillness he reserved for cases concluded but not forgotten. "Do you believe she will seek a continued relationship with her half-sister?" I asked. He shrugged. "Blood has memory, but it does not guarantee sentiment. Still, a door has been opened. Whether they walk through it together is no longer our affair." A boy ran past us, flying a paper kite that sagged in the quiet air. We paused by the edge of the water. The ducks moved sluggishly in the grey shallows. "And Gerald?" I asked. "He may yet surprise us," Holmes said, "but more likely he will drink himself into irrelevance." The statement was not cruel, only coolly observational. Holmes seldom wasted emotion on inevitabilities. We reached a bench beneath a frost-stiffened plane tree and sat in silence for a time, the distant sounds of the city softened by the park's wide expanse. Holmes lit a cigarette, the sulphur of the match briefly flaring in the dusk. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke dissipate into nothing. "You know, Watson," he said at last, "I have often thought that secrets are like locks, not merely mechanisms, but symbols. A lock, after all, presumes both a danger and a value. One does not lock the trivial." I nodded. "But," he continued, his gaze distant, "a lock is only as strong as the secret it defends. And once opened, there is no locking it again." He flicked the ash into the gravel and stood. As we walked on, I thought of the housekeeper, of Emily and Claire, of a signature on parchment, and of the quiet, irreversible act of knowing. Some truths, I reflected, cannot be returned to silence. As we passed the last bare trees of Hyde Park, the grey sky casting long shadows across the walk, Holmes slowed his pace and glanced at the water. "A lock, Watson," he said quietly, "is a curious thing. It pretends to keep danger out. But in truth, it is often what keeps truth in." And when the lock twist buried in the past,